Most people have experienced periods in life where the same types of situations, emotions they're feeling, or relationship dynamics seem to repeat over and over again. Different people, different circumstances, but somehow familiar feelings. And after a while, many of us began asking ourselves, why does this keep happening? Sometimes we don't even realize we're repeating the same emotional patterns because the details look different each time. Different relationships, different jobs, different phases of life. But underneath it all, we may still be reacting from the same fears, wounds, habits, emotional conditioning, or survival responses we've carried for years. And when we haven't slowed down long enough to recognize those deeper patterns, life has a way of continuing to place similar experiences back in front of us until we begin noticing the emotions and the fears or the beliefs that's driving them. This is also one of the reasons I personally find numerology so interesting. And for those of you who are here, my name is Priscilla Daphney. A large part of the work that I do centers around intuitive guidance, emotional patterns, numerology, and self-awareness. Not because I believe numbers magically control our lives or predict every single detail of our future, but because numerology often helps reveal recurring emotional patterns, personal cycles, strengths and challenges, behaviors that we may not fully recognize while we're caught in the middle of living through them. For many of us, numerology becomes less about numbers themselves and really more about self-awareness. It becomes a tool for reflection and pattern recognition. Sometimes it helps explain why certain relationship dynamics continue repeating, why we overextend ourselves, why we struggle with trust, boundaries, grief, self-worth, emotional expression, independence, codependence, fear of rejection, constantly feeling responsible for everybody else around us. And sometimes seeing those patterns reflecting back to us differently is what finally helps us recognize parts of ourselves we may have struggled to fully understand before. Not from a place of judgment, but rather from a place of awareness. Because many of the patterns that we carry were not consciously chosen. Some were inherited through childhood experiences and childhood traumas. Some developed through painful experiences, rejection, grief, instability, emotional neglect, disappointment, insecurity, and survival. And after a while, those responses can become so automatic that we stop separating who we truly are from the conditioning and survival responses we've adapted to overcome. We begin assuming this is just who I am. This is how I handle things. And my favorite, yeah, it is what it is. But many of those responses were learned. As an example, um, we may become overly independent because at some point we stop trusting ourselves to fully show up for ourselves. On the other hand, we may become overly codependent when we stop trusting ourselves. Or we may constantly overextend ourselves to other people because we learned to associate our value with being needed. And on the other hand, we may struggle to ask for help because we've spent so much time underestimating our own worth, minimizing our needs, or believing we have to carry everything alone. Some of us avoid difficult conversations to keep the peace, while others become hypervigilant, overthinking everything in an attempt to avoid getting hurt again. And over time, those patterns can become so familiar that we stop questioning them entirely, even when they're no longer healthy for us. For example, Someone who grows up in a highly critical, emotionally unavailable, or unhealthy environment may later find themselves repeatedly drawn towards similar relationship dynamics in adulthood, not because those relationships feel good, but because they feel very familiar. And even when we consciously recognize that certain dynamics are unhealthy for us, there still can be a strong emotional pull toward what we've spent years psychologically and emotionally conditioned to accept, understand, and identify with. Patterns don't only appear in relationships either. They more often than not appear in the way that we speak to ourselves, including the negative self-talk we may not even realize has become a constant in the background of our daily lives. They can appear in the way we handle stress or avoid rest in favor of constant productivity. I know I'm very guilty of that. Um, or in the way that we continuously seek external validation, overwork ourselves, or struggle to feel worthy unless we're achieving something. One of the most difficult parts of self-awareness is realizing that patterns don't always repeat loudly or dramatically. Sometimes we appear in smaller, everyday ways we barely notice at first. The way we apologize for things that don't require an apology. You know, like I always feel so deeply for people who, when they're struggling with something painful, and then apologize for becoming emotional while talking about it. I just want to say, like, there's no reason to apologize for how you feel, and there's certainly no reason to apologize for showing it. And if this is you out there, I see you, I hear you, and I validate you. And you never need to apologize for your emotions. We may downplay our own needs. We may immediately expect rejection or disappointment, or assume we'll eventually be criticized, left behind, or emotionally abandoned before anything has even happened. And how many of us carry those fears without fully understanding where they come from? I know I do. Over time, those emotional responses begin shaping the way that we move through our lives, our relationships, opportunities, conflict, trust or distrust, and especially the way that we view ourselves internally, which is also why so many of us struggle to hear our own intuition clearly in the first place. Because when we're constantly operating from fear, emotional conditioning, stress, overthinking, emotional numbness, or survival responses, it becomes much harder to recognize the difference between old patterns and genuine inner knowing. And unfortunately, awareness alone doesn't instantly change those patterns overnight. Because when we recognize certain emotional habits within ourselves, we often still feel pulled toward what's familiar, familiar reactions, familiar relationships, familiar emotional responses. And does any of this sound familiar? It definitely does for me. And it's not always because those familiarities are healthy, but because they're known, they're established. One of the reasons recurring patterns can feel so frustrating is because we often assume that once we intellectually understand something, the emotional pattern should immediately disappear too. But emotional growth rarely works that way. And many of us can recognize a pattern clearly and still struggle with changing it. We may still react emotionally, we may still fall back into old habits, and we may still question ourselves. And FYI, this is not a failure. Sometimes it simply means we're becoming more aware of patterns that have been deeply rooted within us for a very long time. The encouraging part is that patterns are not permanent simply because they've existed for a long time. Awareness creates the opportunity for change. And while meaningful change rarely happens overnight, even becoming conscious of certain emotional habits or reactions can begin changing the way we respond to ourselves, our relationships, and the experiences that we have throughout life. Sometimes growth begins with recognizing that we no longer want to continue repeating what once felt familiar. Sometimes it begins with healthier boundaries, more honest conversations, greater self-respect, self-worth, learning to trust ourselves more fully, or finally recognizing that survival patterns we've developed years ago may no longer be serving the person we're becoming now. Sometimes the most important realization is not simply recognizing that a pattern exists, but realizing we're finally tired of carrying it, tired of repeating the same emotional cycles, tired of abandoning ourselves to keep other people comfortable, tired of living in survival mode, tired of constantly questioning our worth, our intuition, and our ability to trust ourselves. Because eventually there comes a point where familiarity no longer feels comforting. It feels exhausting. And often that exhaustion becomes the very thing that finally pushes us to begin changing. If conversations like this resonate with you, I share more reflective guidance around intuition, emotional patterns, numerology, grief, and self-awareness here on this channel. I also offer privately prepared numerology and intuitive sessions designed to be experienced in your own space and timing rather than through emotionally draining live calls or rushed appointments. My sessions are thoughtfully prepared in advance and delivered in a more reflective format so that you have the ability to revisit the information at your own pace anytime. You can learn more here, and you can visit my website at priscilladaphney.com. And thank you for being here.